in fact, fascist movements everywhere use the rhetoric of corruption. They're all anti-corruption campaigns.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City and points west. Nothing seems to change for the inhabitants of Gaza. At the beginning of this new year, Israeli military planes conducted 10 raids on different areas of the Gaza Strip on January 15th. There was intensive bombing all over the Gaza Strip ghetto concentration camp. If you see this show before the 19th, note that a writer from the Gaza Strip named Yusuf al-Jamal will be speaking along with Mazen Kumsiya at 2 p.m. on the 19th at the Palestine Museum U.S. in Woodbridge, Connecticut, as part of Promoting Enduring Peace's Schaefer Lecture. In Iran, popular anger against the regime that had been diverted by Trump's assassination of Soleimani has broken out again. The spark was exposure of a lie. Initially, Iran's government had totally denied that its own forces had shot down a Ukrainian civilian airliner carrying Iranians. Then, faced with video evidence, the Rouhani government admitted that it had mistakenly killed 176 Iranians. So it was revealed not only to be incompetent, but lying. Imagine, while firing missiles at U.S. troops in Iraq, the regime didn't think to shut down civilian air traffic in Iran. The result was the catastrophe. This compounds the grief by Iranians over 50 people crushed to death in the demonstrations encouraged by the Iranian government. Soleimani was known to be a brutal hardliner in favor of violent suppression of demonstrations, so his poster was a target of these brave Iranians. These are demonstrations at Amr Kabir University. Iran's most famous actress, Tarneh Aladosti, told her 6 million Instagram followers, "We are not citizens, we are hostages, millions of hostages." Of course, Trump hypocritically expressed support for Iranians, the same Iranians he won't let into the United States, the same Iranians who suffer under sanctions designed to torment the Iranian people. The trick is to support Iranian democratic forces against their tyrannical government, while at the same time exposing the utter hypocrisy and massive violence of the U.S. government. A furious denunciation of Trump's gunslinging came from an unlikely source. A Canadian corporate executive of MLF, Maple Leaf Foods, tweeted, "The collateral damage of this irresponsible, dangerous, ill-conceived behavior, 63 Canadians needlessly lost their lives in the crossfire, including the family of one of my MLF colleagues, his wife and 11-year-old son. We are mourning and I am livid. Michael McCain." We turn to Syria first with video from a devastated Marat Numan.
destruction that was caused by Assad regime and Russian jet fighters to the entire districts of Ma'arat and Oman city. Shops and residential homes have been destroyed and turned into rubble. The only question that comes to mind is how civilians who fled the bombing for their safety might ever come back here after Assad regime and Russia destroyed their homes and the city and turned it into a ghost town. Despite the ceasefire which was announced by Turkish Defense Ministry, civilians have not returned yet because the Assad regime forces are still targeting the city with artillery shelling. A true ceasefire needs to include all sorts of bombing and shelling to ensure the safe return of civilians to their homes and put an end to the catastrophic humanitarian situation they are facing every day.
This is a photo of Shadi. He was killed by Assad or Russian bombs along with 20 other civilians in Idlib on January 15th. A bit of positive news. 2 documentary films about Syria were nominated for the Academy Award this year. One is called The Cave, the other one for Sama.
The age of democracy.
Now, from last October at an event hosted by Between the Lines, Jason Stanley. He's a philosophy professor at Yale University, author of the book How Fascism Works. He explains how fascists divert justified anger of working people and middle-class people into hatred of educated elites and unpopular minorities.
I completely agree with Christopher Vales's first talk, and my work focuses, in fact, on what I call fascist politics or fascist rhetoric, since we don't face the threat yet of a fascist state. Vales is absolutely right that there are few states that have been fascist. But history shows us that fascism as an ideology, fascism as a rhetoric, breaks down democracy. And my focus is on that danger. Even without the development of a fascist state, our democracy can be placed in peril and has been placed in peril in U.S. history by fascist rhetoric. And there's so much so what is fascist rhetoric? And the left here faces a challenge, because it's when you say, oh, the government is lying to us. Look, the government has always lied to us. The US government has always lied to us. There's nothing new about governments lying to you. That's not a novel feature of the current information environment. So what's incumbent upon us and what's incumbent upon the left is to explain what's distinctive about the current situation, while admitting and agreeing that there were very bad things about the status quo that enabled it. And that's the distinctive task. And in fact, fascist movements everywhere use the rhetoric of corruption. They're all anti-corruption campaigns. In my book, I discuss one historian who wonders about the Nazis. He says the Nazis were the most corrupt regime in history. Sure, Hitler was a devout anti-Semite, but many Nazis could care less about anti-Semitism. They just wanted Jewish art and property. And yet, they constantly ran anti-corruption campaigns. Putin, in 2011, runs an anti-corruption campaign. Putin, who by according to many sources, is the wealthiest man alive. Orban has run an anti-corruption campaign. Jair Bolsonaro ran an anti-corruption campaign. And these are all massively corrupt politicians. So what's happening? Well, what's happening is the basis, what underlies this is the very basis of the ideology of fascism. And that's a distinction between us and them, that's a transformation of the information space into a battle between us and them, into a battle of tribal politics, where the tribal politics is based upon ethnicity, race, religion, some combination of these, and not, say, class. So the idea is there is a true people, a true American, and they live in the countryside. This is what I do in my book, is I step you through 10 different aspects of fascist politics, which I will discuss, I will briefly run through. They generally live in the true people live in the countryside. They're traditional, they're patriarchal. The bad, decadent people, the foreigners, live in the city. It's a war between us and them. Chapter 2 of Mein Kampf is called My Study and Struggles in Vienna. And in it, chapter 1, of course, is it's called My Hometown. It's about his wonderful little country hometown and how there's real German traditions. And then he goes to Vienna with our foreign tongues spoken everywhere, and Jews, and more Jews. The out-group always lives in the city. Think in America what inner city is used to mean. So the idea is what you do in fascist politics is you create this idea of a pure group, a pure, real nation that once was great and is under threat, and has been placed under threat. And you hearken back to this greatness and you bemoan its loss, and you get people to think that their anxiety and fear is due to the loss of this fabled, fictionalized past. So the connection here to patriarchy that Christopher discussed is that runs through fascism throughout the 20th century. Wilhelm Reich's book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, focuses on patriarchy as the element, because you can get then men to think, oh, once I was glorious and worshipped and respected just because I was a man, and I lost that because of feminism. Hitler blames women's equality on Jews. I mean, I'll take it. But so you create a hierarchy. You create a hierarchy, and that is the central fascist myth. The central fascist myth is that of hierarchy, that one group is better than another, that men are better than women, that whites are better than blacks, that Germans, non-Jewish Germans are better than Jewish Germans, that Hindus are better than Muslims, that Jews are better than Palestinians. You create a hierarchy, and then you feed that hierarchy with a fiction of a pure golden past. You can so in the Hindutva movement in India is based on the idea that India was once a pure Hindu nation, and then it was invaded by Muslims. I've been attacked by Hindutva supporters on Twitter recently and placed in various categories that attract that, and I focus on RSS and BJP in my book as an example of a fascist movement. And they're saying things like, the Muslims invaders killed tens of millions of Hindus. I'm like, what are you talking about? They mean 1,000 years ago. So the idea is, a long time ago, this country was ours. And then some people came. Who cares if it was 1,000 years ago? They don't belong here. They're invaders. Here we see Israel is ideally set up for this ideology, right? Oh, these people have lived here for 1,000+ years. They don't really belong here. It's our country. That's what and that's very similar structures happening in India. So what now? When you take this dialectic to the United States, you're looking at a much more recent golden age, so-called golden age. Fascism requires this golden age. The golden age I think you're looking at is the American South, the antebellum South, a place to which Hitler looked for as a model. So the antebellum South, if you look at the ideology of the antebellum South, it is, or you look at the ideology of the war of northern aggression, the lost cause. It is, we had a great empire. We were invaded. The liberals forced us to accept an equality that is inconsistent with our traditions. This is part, now it's a recent golden age, but it's all the more effective for its recency. When you look at what Orban does, Orban in Hungary looks back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Greater Hungary, its loss in Trianon in World War I. Now, it's all fake, because if you look back at quote-unquote Greater Hungary before Trianon, it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual place, as empires are. It wasn't pure Hungary. Similarly, Law and Justice in Poland talks about the Second Republic before the Second World War as a pure Polish Catholic place. Well, my mother is here, and who's Polish Jewish and grew up in Poland and came here in 1948. As she can attest, there were 3 million Jews living in Poland before World War II. It's an entire, complete fiction that Poland was a pure Catholic nation before World War II. Polish Jews were involved at every level, and yet somehow the ideology enabled the ideology of purity and the ideology of disgust at mixtures enables people to entertain these fictions. So the first laws, the laws that are at the center of fascist movements, are always anti-miscegenation laws. The Nazis took, as James Whitman, my colleague at Yale shows, the Nazi lawyers carefully studied our anti-miscegenation laws that banned marriages between whites and blacks. They were the basis for the Nuremberg laws that stripped citizenship from my 3-year-old father in Berlin, who is German Jewish, and illegalized marriages between Aryans and non-Aryans. Why this focus? By the way, the Nazi lawyers thought that the U.S. anti-miscegenation laws, based as they were on the one-drop rule, were untethered from reality, and so decided on 1/8. So if you're ever thinking of our susceptibility to fascism, that we were considered too extreme. So anti-miscegenation laws are so key here to fascism. And as I document in How Fascism Works, you find this in India, you find this across the board. 2014, there was the Hindu love jihad, where it was a panic about Muslims getting their sons to marry Hindu women and convert them to Islam by falling in love with them. So the panic is always about intermixtures between groups, because purity is at the very basis of fascist ideology. And again, to emphasize our susceptibility in the history of fascist ideology in the United States, if you think about what Angela Davis calls the myth of the black rapist, the panic, what underlay the lynching of thousands of black Americans, the idea that there was some kind of epidemic of black women raping white men. That is core. That's what you have as the core of fascist ideology. That panic, you create a panic, what I call, there's a chapter in my book called Sexual Anxiety. You create a panic about intermixture, intermarriage, create a panic about the threat of rape. The Rohingya in Myanmar, the whole Rohingya ethnic cleansing and genocide starts in 2012 when 3 Rohingya men sexually assault a Rakhine woman, and then the entire Rohingya community is placed in 180 some villages, and then 5 years of hate directed against them results ultimately in their ethnic cleansing and perhaps genocide. And no one notices, as Timothy Snyder once said, in this ideology, the in-group men cannot rape. What they do to out-group women is not rape. Like the Rohingya horror that what happened in Myanmar to the Rohingya involved the mass rape of Rohingya women, and yet they say the Rohingya men are rapists. So that's part of this structure, that there's a panic. You have a pure group that has always occupied the land, that has traditionally occupied the land, and then liberals and elites want to replace them, want to displace their power. Some shadowy group, it was the Jews, but for the Nazis, wants to replace their power, wants to replace them by minority groups that will then intermingle and destroy the greatness of the traditional people. Now, when you set things up like this, that it's a war between purity and infection, that it's a conflict between purity and greatness, and that which seeks to tear it down and dirty it and pollute it, then you make people think that reality doesn't matter. It's a war. It's a war. And what does corruption mean, given this background? Well, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction says, so I learned, I turned 40 plus 10 last week, and so I'm old enough to have gone to schools where I learned that Reconstruction came to an end because black people were not ready for democracy, because they were too corrupt. That, by the way, is false. Du Bois's 1935 book, Black Reconstruction, is all about its falsity. And Du Bois says the white historians declared that corruption led to the end of Reconstruction. What was meant by corruption? That 4 million black people were finally responsible for their own self-rule. That's what they mean by corruption. And that's why what corruption means in the mouths of fascist politicians. It means that the wrong people are in charge. It means the spoils of the nation are going to the wrong people. The spoils of the nation should be going to the real people of the nation, and in particular to their leader and representative. That's what corruption means in the mouths of fascist politicians. And so truth doesn't matter because it's a conflict. And what you try to do if you're doing this kind of politics is you try to say, look, it's a war. We have this precious thing to defend. And if I lie, I'm lying for you. And so that's why. So I published a piece on November 4th in the New York Times, November 4th, 2016, called Beyond Lying, Donald Trump's authoritarian rhetoric, where I and it was the most read piece in the New York Times the weekend before the election, but it didn't work. And in it I said the media made this horrible error by constantly repeating the lies and saying they're lies, they're lies, they're lies, and didn't understand why it didn't decrease Trump's support. It's because Trump is not running on the basis of I've got better policy for you. He's not running on the basis of I'm giving you better arguments. He's running on the basis of I'm white and they're destroying whiteness, and I'm going to be great to show them how great whiteness is. And maleness. That's essentially how he's running. And I'm going to reflect, they're destroying you culturally, the liberal elite are destroying you culturally, they're replacing you by women and non-whites in the cultural space, and I'm going to occupy the cultural space. And as Donald Trump said once when he was asked, what do you mean by poor white trash? He said poor white trash. He said someone just like me but poor. So in the culture industry, Adorno talks about the little big man as the fascist leader. The little big man is someone who has achieved something stunning. Maybe he lives in a gold palace in the sky. He's achieved something stunning, but he's just like you. In Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt talks about the importance of vulgarity. When you create this sense that your culture's been stripped from you, your dominance in the culture has been replaced, then people want revenge against those who have done this injustice. And Arendt says Arendt says they like the idea that the elite will have to bow and scrape before someone they regard as vulgar, a house painter perhaps, meaning Hitler. So the idea is that there's a pleasure, a visceral pleasure, that comes from the elite having to bow and scrape in front of people that everyone knows, in front of someone that people know the elite despise. This is what we call now owning the libs, right? There's a lot of pleasure that Trump supporters get simply from owning the libs, from getting people to get upset, and that's what Arendt tells us the attraction. It doesn't matter if they're losing health insurance. It doesn't matter if there's a $1.5 trillion tax cut for the wealthy. It doesn't matter. What matters is having people like me squirm. So the lies don't matter. The lies are what they like, or what people like, because they're like, look at how it makes the libs squirm. So now, how to defeat this? One of the things we're supposed to discuss is how to defeat this. How to return people to the idea that we have common citizenry across our differences. That this is a particular problem in a country whose history is structured on white supremacy, but it's something that we have to face. We somehow have to return our politics to a class politics. We have to return our politics. We have to refocus on labor movements. We have to remind people that everyone loves the weekend, and owning the libs is not worth losing the weekend. Thank you.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.